All right. Hey guys. I might wait just a few more seconds, see if anybody else joins, but I didn't expect a large group here since we're down to just a few people doing work right now, it seems like. If you do you guys have any specific questions or you want me to just kind of review some of the stuff that I jotted down, or anybody have any specific questions to start out?
No, I don't have any specific questions, just like an overall thing of the unit.
All right.
All right.
Okay, so I just jotted some stuff down that's not necessarily in any particular order, but I wanted to go over some terms and concepts and stuff. Um, so first off, there's the idea of courts having jurisdiction. That's like their authority, the type of authority they have. So one of the big differentiating or factors is like, do you have original or appellate jurisdiction? Remember, original, just think of the word original as like first. So they have the first, that courts that have original jurisdiction they're the first ones to hear a case. Courts that have appellate jurisdiction hear cases only on appeal. The US Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction, but the vast majority of their cases are heard under their appellate jurisdiction. So the only time they would be the first to hear a case if it was like a state versus a state in court, like Georgia suing Florida, could go straight to the Supreme Court or something, or if like a foreign government's involved. So probably like 99% of their cases are heard on appeal, but you should know like the district courts, the federal district courts have original jurisdiction only, and the US courts of appeal or the circuit courts have appellate jurisdiction. Another term from your outline was a grand jury. So there's a difference between a grand jury and what we call like a petit jury or petty jury, so a grand jury listens to evidence to decide if someone should be brought to trial. So remember, the government acts as a prosecution in criminal cases. So a grand jury would be a group of jurors who listen to the government's evidence to see if there's enough to warrant a trial in the first place. So it's like an extra protection, so people aren't brought in for trial under like with flimsy evidence or something. So a grand jury decides if a trial should go forward. A petty jury, or just like a trial jury, decides if you're actually guilty or innocent or not. It's really guilty or not guilty. All right. So we talked, or that on the PowerPoint that I put out was we talked about the steps in the Supreme Court deciding a case. So I just was going to go through those quickly. So first they have to decide what to decide, right? So that they receive like 8,000 or so petitions from various people appealing their case to the Supreme Court every year. And they only hear about 80 cases for full argument. So that means they only accept about 1% of the cases that are appealed to them. So the Supreme Court first has to decide which cases are big enough and important enough to accept in the first place. They use what's called a rule of four. That means at least 4 justices have to agree to hear the case. 4 of the 9 justices have to say, yeah, we think this case is worth our review. Okay. If they do accept the case, they issue what's called a writ of certiorari, which is a Latin term to be made more certain. They're basically ordering the lower court to send up all of the records and information that they have on that case so they can review it. The next step would be like the submission of briefs. Briefs are just legal arguments. So the lawyers representing the 2 sides in the case would each submit their written arguments to the court as to why they think their side should win. You also could get you need to know what these things called amicus curiae briefs, like it means like friends of the court. So you could have like interest groups who want to weigh in on the case, even though they're not directly involved in the case. So for instance, if it was a gun case, like regulation of guns, maybe the NRA would submit an amicus brief. That would be something else the court would maybe look at and consider. Okay. So just stop me if you guys have specific questions. But the next step would be, so after they review the briefs, they have what's called oral arguments. And that's when the lawyers get to go before the court and actually make their case in person. They get 30 minutes. So the court doesn't have, they never have a full trial like we would normally see in a courtroom. They never have jurors. They never have witnesses, anything like that. All they do is listen to the arguments of the two sides. Okay. So that's the oral arguments. Then the court meets in what's called a conference. So at the end of the week, after they've heard cases, they meet together privately in the Supreme Court conference. That's where they decide the cases and actually make their rulings behind closed doors. Okay. So the purpose of a conference is to make rulings and discuss the cases. They also would use the conference time to like accept future cases on appeal. So they're because the appeals are constantly coming in, to the court. The last step would be to actually make their ruling public, and they do that in the form of what's called a majority opinion, and that's where they just issue their ruling in writing, and they explain why, what their ruling is in that case and why they made that decision. Remember, the court is supposed to rely heavily on what's called precedent, which is like past rulings. They're supposed to look to what the courts decided in the past, but they don't have to stick with precedent. They can overturn precedent. But precedent is just like past decisions that serve as an example for the court. Anyway, so then you can also have a majority. The majority opinion is the official ruling that's agreed to by 5 or more justices. Anyone can be assigned to write the opinion. The Chief Justice gets to decide who writes the opinion if he's part of the majority. If not, it's the most senior member who's in the majority. Speaking of Chief Justice, you should know who the current Chief Justice is. There's only been like 17 Chief Justices in our history. So it's John Roberts. Anyway, so the majority opinion, but you could also have a concurring opinion, which means a concurring opinion means you write an opinion where you agree with the ruling of the court, but maybe you want to explain it a little differently. You want to say why you agree, but for different reasons. And then you can write a dissenting opinion, which is you disagree with the court's ruling. So justices who disagree with the majority ruling can write an opinion, but the only one that really has legal standing is the majority opinion. So those are sort of what you need. That's what you need to know about the sort of different steps in the court deciding cases. And then when cases are appealed to the court, it can come from 2 places. Usually cases are appealed to the Supreme Court from the circuit courts, the U.S. courts of appeal. So it would go from district court to circuit court to Supreme Court. But you can also appeal certain cases from the state's highest courts. So like if the Georgia Supreme Court made a ruling, if it's also relevant to the United States Constitution, the Supreme Court could review their ruling. So the U.S. Supreme Court can, in some cases, overturn a state Supreme Court's ruling. Okay. But we do have what's called a dual court system. That just means that we have separate federal courts and state courts. They each kind of operate separately. The only time they overlap is in that case I just explained. If the state Supreme Court makes a ruling, sometimes that's appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But otherwise, state courts and federal courts have separate jurisdictions. State courts handle cases of state law. So if I was suing my neighbor, that would be handled in Georgia, right? That would be a civil case. But let's say Coca-Cola was suing Pepsi for like some type of whatever problem they have with them, copying their ads or formulas or whatever, that could go to federal court because it would be companies located in 2 different states, and probably the amount of money they would be seeking would be a significant amount of money. Anyway, so like if it's people from different states, that might end up in federal court. Also, if it deals with federal law, it would go to federal court. So if someone's accused of breaking a federal law, they would be tried in federal court. If you're accused of breaking a state law, it would be tried in state court, right? Federal court also deals with anything coming up under the U.S. Constitution, and if anything with a foreign government or foreign official is in court, and also like bankruptcy cases go to the federal courts and so forth. So there's a couple questions on your outline that deal with those things. But yeah, so we have a dual court system. And remember, the principle of federalism is that it reflects our principle of federalism because we have a separate national court system and then 50 different state court systems. Okay, so that kind of shows our belief in federalism, having division of power, division of authority between national and state governments. In the PowerPoint, I also went over the criminal versus civil cases. So just be aware of some of the differences. A criminal case is when you violate the law and you can go to prison if you're found guilty. A civil case is a dispute between individuals. There is no violation of law. It's just a conflict or dispute that you're asking a jury or judge to settle. And so there's no way you would go to prison if you were found liable in a civil case. In a criminal case, the government is always the one bringing the charges. The prosecution, it's the prosecution versus the defendant. In a civil case, it's called the plaintiff versus the defendant. A civil case can involve the government, like I could sue the government, or the state of Georgia could sue state of Florida. That's still a civil case. But yeah, so civil case can involve governments, but doesn't have to. It can be to regular citizens. A criminal case always involves the government because they're the ones prosecuting the crime, prosecuting someone who's been accused of a crime. Another difference has to do with the jury. Like in a criminal case, the jury has to be certain of your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil case, the jury just has to be sort of 51% sure that one side should win over the other. And so it's a different burden, different standard of proof. It's also a different burden of proof. In a criminal case, the government 100% has to prove that you're guilty. If you're accused of a crime, you don't have to prove you're innocent. Remember that the idea is that you're innocent until proven guilty. The government, the prosecution, completely has to convince the jury that you're guilty. You don't have, the defense will try to put on a case and like poke holes in the prosecution's arguments, but they don't have to. It's totally up to the government to prove the case. Okay. Let's see. Just in general, you know, the Supreme or the federal courts are unique for several reasons. One is they're not elected, right? So you become a judge, a federal judge, simply by being appointed by the president and approved by a majority vote of the Senate. The Constitution doesn't even include any qualifications to be a federal judge. Like the president, you have to be 35 years old and natural born citizen, all that stuff, right? To be in the House, you have to be 25 years old and a citizen for 7 years. And Senate, you have to be 30 years old and citizen for 9 years. For whatever reason, the founders didn't put anything. So remember, also judicial branch is described in Article 3. In Article 3, they didn't say anything about qualifications. So, you know, they kind of just left it open. So the president can pick someone and the Senate has to approve them. You should also, speaking of that, you should know the term senatorial courtesy. That's the idea that like when a president appoints a lower court judge, especially like district court judge, traditionally presidents will consult with the senators from that state because district courts exist within the states, even though they're federal courts. And so the president, if President Trump was appointing a new judge to the Northern District of Georgia, he would probably consult with our 2 senators first if he followed the tradition of senatorial courtesy. He would say, hey, here's, or, you know, someone in his administration would call them up and say, you know, here's who I'm thinking of appointing. Do you guys think this is a good choice, or do you have any objections? Especially considering the fact that Georgia has 2 Republican senators right now. So that the president's Republican, he's going to consult before making that choice. So that's tradition, at least. I'm not sure Trump does it as much, but most presidents have done that. Let's see. Remember, judges are appointed for life. So really, they serve on good behavior, meaning that they can serve as long as they want. The only way you can get rid of a federal judge is through the impeachment process if they break the law, do something corrupt. So they can be impeached and removed just like the president can. But they get a lifetime appointment. That's partly to give them more independence, right? We want judges to be more unbiased or more nonpartisan, non-political. So the lifetime appointment doesn't make them immune from pressure, but it helps shield them from public pressure. Because remember, they're, unlike the other branches, they're not elected by the people. They're not really supposed to be responsive to the people. They're supposed to be responsive to the Constitution and the law. So judges' main job, remember, is to interpret the law, to apply the law. So we don't want that to be done with like political bias. Now, of course, the reality is judges do have political opinions and biases, but we want to shield them or protect them from that as much as possible. So the lifetime appointment makes it harder for the other branches or the people to like get angry with judges and try to punish them or remove them for like a controversial ruling. There's a couple cases you guys need to know from the outline. We talked about, there's two big cases that relate to this unit. One was Marbury versus Madison. Remember, the main power the courts have in terms of checks and balances is they can strike down laws. Under judicial review, they can strike down laws that are unconstitutional, and they can also declare presidential actions or orders to be unconstitutional. So that's called judicial review. Marbury versus Madison was the first Supreme Court case where the court exercised the power of judicial review. It's the first time they actually used their power to strike down a law. And then McCulloch versus Maryland was another important case in the 1800s where the court said, remember, Maryland tried to tax the national bank, and they said Maryland can't tax the national bank because national power is superior to state power, the supremacy clause. It also said Congress can create a national bank because Maryland was claiming they couldn't. And that shows the broad, it was a victory for like broad national power and the lawmaking power of Congress, right, with the necessary and proper clause. We also did a little activity on judicial activism versus judicial restraint. So remember, judicial activism is sort of the idea that judges who follow judicial activism are willing to like push their own agenda, let their own opinions influence their rulings. You know, they're not afraid to overturn a decision of the government, of like the Congress or something, for example, or the president, if they think the Congress, the president simply just did something that was unjust or unwise. Whereas if you follow judicial restraint, you try to defer to the elected branches whenever possible. And so you wouldn't overturn something unless you find it to be clearly unconstitutional. So you kind of try to withhold your personal views and not let those affect your decisions. The reality is most judges kind of do both, depending on the situation. But anyway, you should understand sort of the difference in those philosophies, right? So if I was like personally opposed to abortion, but I didn't find any reason, like if a state made abortion legal and someone challenged it, if I personally oppose it, but I don't find any constitutional reason to overturn it, and so I just let the law stand and not strike it down, that would be judicial restraint. If I think, well, I don't really find anything in the Constitution about abortion, but I personally think it's bad, so I'm going to say that this state can't allow abortions or something, that would be judicial activism. Okay. So, and then just so I said, in general, checks and balances, the main check the president has over the courts is he appoints judges. The main check Congress has is they have to approve the judges, the Senate, and also that they can impeach and remove judges. And then the biggest check that the courts have over the other two branches is judicial review. So they can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. So I think, so those are some of the main, oh, and you remember the American Bar Association? Yeah, that was on your outline. The American Bar Association, they're a group, it's just an interest group of lawyers, national group of lawyers. And they've traditionally just taken it upon themselves to try to play a role in the judicial nomination process. So when the president nominates any federal judge, the ABA has a committee of volunteers who review that judge's qualifications. They look into their background and study their education and history and stuff. And they give recommendations on whether they think that judge is qualified to be a federal judge. So they give them a rating like qualified, well qualified, qualified, or not qualified. And although that the president can nominate whoever he wants and the Senate can approve whoever they want, because President Trump has actually nominated several judges who were rated as not qualified by the ABA. But it's worth noting that they've traditionally played a role. So like if a judge has, like President Obama had several he had like 6 or 10 judges who were rated not qualified. And so he withdrew those nominations because he didn't want to put forward a judge that the ABA thought was unqualified. So it's usually, they play an informal role, but it's still like a traditionally important role in the process. And remember, like when they hold hearings, the Senate holds confirmation hearings. So the Senate has the final decision whether to approve the judge or not. They can reject an appointee, but they usually approve presidential nominees. All right. That's kind of those are the main things I wrote down. Are there any other specific questions? Or the test has other things like a few charts and reading passages and stuff, but that's not something you really need to study for. You just need to analyze the charts and tables and stuff. So this unit's not as hard as some of the other ones. So as long as you study your outline, study the PowerPoint and PowerPoint notes, and and just if you guys watch that video I put out with the questions, that should be pretty good. Those three, the PowerPoint notes, the PowerPoint itself, the outline, and the video handout should cover most of the material. So it's open note. You guys can have that stuff out. Any other questions or?
No, I don't have any.
All right, so that's just, hopefully that clarifies. If you guys don't have any questions, I really, that was just a broad overview of stuff. But I'm still working on the test. If I get a chance, I may put out a study guide. But yeah, I think if you have those 3 handouts, you should be pretty well covered. All right.
All right. Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. Well, I know that was pretty quick, but since there's only 3 of us, anyway. But you guys know that the final exam, if you're planning on taking it, we're probably going to post that on Friday. But you can take it Friday, Monday, or Tuesday. So if you're not ready, if you're going to take it and you're not ready on Friday, you can also take it next Monday or Tuesday.
Are there going to be like study guides for it, or what?
Yeah, I'll put out a study guide for the when it may have more on it than what you're going to actually be tested on, but because we're going to shorten up the final a little bit this year.
Yeah.
But yeah, so maybe a little bit more than you need to know, but it'll be more of a broad overview of like, what you need to know.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
All right. Anything else? Or?
No, I'm good.
I know if you guys have friends who are taking AP government, their exam.
Oh yeah, I got exams today.
So
yeah,
been dealing with that a lot. So, all right, guys. Well, thanks and good luck, and it'll be up tomorrow.
All right, thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.